still impacting from home. My name is Andrea. I'm the co-founder of Net Impact Amsterdam, and we are a member association for professionals who have made the deliberate choice to use our career as a force for good. We will record today's session, so yeah, if you want to pop your camera off for that purpose, perfectly okay. And if you want to ask questions, please welcome them in the chat. So at any moment, you can send those through. I'm so excited to introduce you to Adriaan Korthuis, who is our guest today. So he is the co-founder of Climate Focus, which is an international advisory firm and think tank that provides climate-related advice to governments, to companies, CEOs, etc. Adriaan, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Super. So he has put together a few slides for us, but Adriaan, do you expect to use those?
Who knows?
Okay, great. Well, in that case, then I can hand over to you to give an introduction to yourself, to Climate Focus, and to the carbon market phenomena in general.
That's a lot of things. Very good. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Nice to be here in this lunch meeting today. I don't know, who of you has ever been involved in carbon markets? You may use the thumbs up in your Zoom or so. Also the ones without a camera, please use your icons in the reactions, whether you are like a no. Not directly, have heard, yes. Okay, well.
I feel like most of us know just enough to be dangerous.
Very good. Okay, let me start by just providing a bit of background about myself and then just diving into the subject. So, Adriaan Korthuis, Climate Focus. As Andrea already mentioned, we are a consultancy working to make impacts in the field of climate change, working on climate policies, climate strategies with large organizations, with large companies, small companies as well. Everything in the field of climate change. We have been there for the past 15 years. I'm one of the founders. Before founding Climate Focus, I've worked with the Dutch government, which in the late 90s and early 2000s still was a front runner in the field of climate change. And there I set up and managed the then carbon credits program. So basically, I've been into carbon credits and related stuff ever since the late 1990s, early 2000s. So that's a while. Well, so much for me now. When Andrea first approached me, asking to provide you with a bit of background about carbon credits, I thought to myself, okay, why would you as individuals and why would you as, well, being staff to companies where you work, be interested in carbon credits? What would it do for you? What would it do for the world? And what, well, what is it, what are we talking about in the first place, and why is this such a subject that pops up every time and again? So what I'd like to do with you now is provide you with some bigger background, try to provide you with basically vocabulary and some insight in what is carbon credits, what can you do with it, and then up to you to, well, either make use of it or not. Let me just start by sharing the screen still. Oh, let's see if it works. And then, okay, you can see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Lovely, good. Okay, good, carbon credits. Carbon credits basically is a mechanism to bring money to projects. Nothing more and nothing less. So it's an invention. It's an invention that we made to basically support projects, mostly in developing countries, that need money to be realized and to be operated. And it works through a unit called a carbon credit. And you see the carbon credit in many different synonyms: carbon credit, carbon offset, VER, CER, VCU, everything. I mean, there's a lot of names for carbon credits. Basically, they represent 1 ton of reduced carbon dioxide, CO2. On the left-hand side, you see that you see projects that need money. And on the right-hand side, you see, well, buyers of carbon credits that, for one reason or another, want to have carbon credits. And they meet in between. And that's where money from buyers goes to projects, and projects sell their certified certificates, which buyers then use for formal reasons. For instance, within a number of trading schemes or emission reduction schemes in the world, you can use certificates to counter your own emissions. Nowadays, you also find a lot of people and companies who, on a voluntary basis, say, okay, I am part of the problem. Because of my lifestyle, because of my business processes, I emit so much. And I actually want to, well, clean that up. But the possibilities within my own livelihood, within my own company, are limited. So, well, then let's do the second best thing and just clean it up by reducing CO2 elsewhere. And that's where these certificates can be used. The carbon projects we're usually talking about are of a very big variety. On the one hand, they are projects that actually take carbon, that take CO2 out of the air. For instance, planting trees. I think that's the most obvious one and most well-known one. And for ordinary people, the ones that are, well, easiest to understand. You see a tree growing, and everything that you see in a tree used to be CO2 that the tree during its growth has taken out of the air. And planting trees comes in a lot of varieties. It can be in plantations. It can be in the restoration of degraded forest areas. It can be in pastures where trees are planted to provide shadow and shade and lower temperatures to the grazing cattle. It can come in all kinds of. Planting trees can come in a lot of varieties. It can come into improving existing forests so they grow better and store more carbon, so have a more dense, a higher density in the forest. That's one. There's so planting trees and everything that comes with it. Other projects that you usually see in the carbon credit world are, for instance, the upper left hand, cooking, clean cooking. As many of you know, and many also don't know, is that billions of people in the world still cook on open fires, which is a practice in Africa, in South Asia, in large parts of South America. And the point with cooking on open fires is that you waste a lot of wood. Of every piece of wood or every piece of charcoal that you use in an open fire, about 90% of the heat gets lost, and about 10% goes into the food. So helping people in, well, cooking their food in a more efficient way helps saving fuel wood or charcoal in a tremendous way, basically avoiding that they need to go out and chop trees in order to eat. So improving cook stoves, improving Cooking practices is also a project category that you see a lot in the field of carbon credits. Then obviously, anything in the field of renewable energy, whether it be solar panels or wind energy or hydropower, in many areas, remote areas in developing countries, people don't have access to electricity. They use, again, wood or diesel generators or what else to provide them with energy. And a renewable energy source can well, be the better alternative and take care of trees not being burned or fossil fuel not being burned. In the lower right hand, you'll see a dug-in biogas tank, which is a tank in which you basically dump the manure from your cattle, which will then ferment, which then will digest, produce methane, which is a gas similar to natural gas, on which people can cook or light their lamps or what have you. Again, replacing the practice of either cooking on firewood or lighting a lamp with kerosene. All these kind of initiatives, and particularly when they are in developing countries, they are hardly viable by themselves because they're expensive, because the people applying those technologies don't have the means to purchase them, so they don't automatically come off the ground, and that's where carbon income from carbon credits can make a difference. So what can carbon finance do for a project? Like I said, it can take care that more money goes to a project so that it becomes viable for the users, particularly when the users are poor or have little cash, little liquidity. Then revenues from, well, a third source can help speeding up implementation or can help getting the project done in the first place. What the promise of carbon income could also mean that project developers can get a pre-finance on what they're doing. They can use the outlook of having carbon income as a collateral for a loan to basically buy the equipment and get going. Of course, there's also, when you have additional income revenue streams, you have a spread risk of where you get your income from. So not only from the primary users, but also from selling carbon credits, which for many project developers is a very welcome hedging mechanism to get stuff going. All of this, that's what carbon credits can do for projects. Now, I'll let you look at this funny graph for a little while, because this is everything that is relevant when it comes to developing carbon credit projects. And here, when you really understand this funny graph that I've been using for a really long time, you start understanding the different things that in normal conversation get terribly mixed. So when you talk of a carbon credit project, then actually you talk of three separate processes. The core thing that matters is, of course, the implementation and the development of a real project, of a tree planting exercise, or of a clean cooking project, or of a wind farm, just the stuff that happens on the ground. You see that in red over here. So you start with a project, the regular development cycle. You start with a project idea, you do a feasibility study, you look for financing. Once financing has been secured, you start construction. After construction, you operate. Very simple as that. That is the basic process for any development, hence also for a carbon project. Then the carbon character of carbon projects makes that you need a lot of red tape and a lot of documentation in order to create carbon credits. And that's what you see in the blue stream. The blue stream is actually everything that needs to be done in order to extract carbon credits from that physical activity that you are implementing. And the carbon development basically exists of first making a project description and having that project description certified. And project description in the lingo of carbon credits development is called PDD, Project Development Document. So you make this project description in which you describe the project, in which you describe how emissions are reduced or how CO2 is sequestrated from the atmosphere. In the PDD, you also describe how you will monitor that in due course. You also argue why the carbon credits will help getting the project, help getting to realize the project. A lot of different things you need to fill in that PDD and argue how you're going to reduce emissions. You will have to validate that, have a third party validate that everything that you're claiming in that PDD is true. And once that is done, you can register your project with one of the standards. Standards, basically organizations that manage registers of projects that are recognized as carbon credit projects. The main carbon credit registers with the carbon credit standards are the gold standard that some of you may know. There is the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standards, and back in the days of the Kyoto Protocol, the largest carbon credit mechanism with the corresponding register was the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, which at the time was the largest carbon credit mechanism available. So once you have a registered project, you'll start implementing your project. And once it is implemented, you are going to monitor how it's going and actually how many emissions you have reduced or how much CO2 you have sequestered from the atmosphere. Most project developers do that on a yearly basis, some on a bi-yearly basis. Depends a bit on how big the project is and how much effort you need to do in order to monitor. In that monitoring report, once again, you have that certified, verified by a third party. And once that is the case, your carbon credits are formally issued by the organization in which you have registered. Okay, so now we have carbon credits. That's the blue part. Then you still don't have money. And that's where the green part of this slide kicks in. The green part is about, well, basically selling your carbon credits. And typically, well, that goes into the market. Depends a bit, there's different ways how you can sell. The very lucky ones among the project developers, they buy forward, meaning they start selling already when the project is still not there. They say, okay, in future I'll have carbon credits. You can already, we can already agree on your buying my future carbon credits. But currently, in the current state of the carbon market, most of the transactions are basically at the very, very end of the road, where project developers have operated their project, have gone through the entire blue process and have issued carbon credits, and then basically go to the market and say, I have carbon credits, please, who buys them? And then it's a matter of demand and supply, how much you will get for your carbon credits. So here, 3 processes, and I think just to have it in the back of your heads, it is essential to understand. It is essential to understand how a carbon project works and what are the different steps. For instance, and I'll come back to that later as well. For instance, the price of carbon credits, as you can see from this sheet, from this illustration, does not really depend on either what the project needs there in the red stream, it also does not depend very much on the cost that you incur in the blue stream, basically in certification. No, it only depends on the supply and demand. So that means when supply is high and demand is low, you logically get very, very, very little for your carbon credits, which is what has happened over the past years. So just to keep in your mind, and I'll come back to that later. Prices, like I said, prices are one of the things there where there is a lot of talk about, and I know quite a few of you probably have seen or have heard of carbon prices of, say, €2, and then think, well, I can buy an offset, like an indulgence for my flight to London, and I pay 50 cents for that back and forth based on a carbon price of €2. What, in God's sake, can I do for the project? Well, probably not so very much, but it's simply a result of supply and demand in the carbon market, and it has nothing to do with how much a project actually needs. So when you talk of prices in carbon markets, there are, well, you can approach that from several directions. On the one hand, there is basically, let's say, the fair price is what it actually costs to produce the carbon credits, which is, well, the financing gap in your project development. When you're designing your project, then you count in like perhaps €10 or €20 as future income, and that, well, makes you confident that you can carry out your project and you can implement your project in a viable way. Of course, that's not said that you will get that 10 to 20 euros as projected. And of course, as a project developer, you will incur cost in the blue part, in the carbon development and certification. And that depends a bit from project to project, how complicated it is. For simple, straightaway renewable energy projects like small wind farms or small solar plants, count on something like 60, 70,000 euros. For more complicated forestry projects, it is definitely 100,000 plus and could easily run into 150, 200,000 just to get your project certified and registered. Then every time you monitor and you want to have your carbon credits issued, count on between 20,000 and 50,000 euros to get that done. This is all cost you incur to enable yourself to sell carbon credits. Market prices, like I told, is something completely different. It's supply and demand. And over the past years, the demand for carbon credits has been extremely low, whereas the supply has been extremely high, basically based on project developers' expectation that there would have been more demand in the market. So we're still at a stage where there's quite a few carbon credits just basically shelved, having gone through, well, from operating projects that had counted on carbon credit income, going through certification processes, and then finding that they could not sell their carbon credits. And then in the end, when there are buyers, even though you've counted on, say, 10 or 20 euros once you made your feasibility study, well, if 2 is the best you can get, then many project developers decide, okay, then I'll accept 2, because that's better than nothing, and my carbon credits might get stale in the end, because the longer I wait selling, the less credible many buyers will find it that, well, I haven't still sold my carbon credits. That's market prices. Then there is a third way how to approach carbon prices, and that is basically looking at it from top down. So if you look at how many tons of CO2 we as the global population need to reduce and what would be the underlying activities to do so, you can calculate the average cost per ton of CO2 reduced that will make us achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Basically, keeping global heating to a maximum of 1.5 degrees. It's been Nicholas Stern and Joseph Stiglitz, two Nobel Prize winning economists, that have made a study on carbon pricing and how much it would cost the world to reduce the carbon that is needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. And they come to the conclusion that this year, the average reduction price of a ton of CO2 should be between 40 and 80 US dollars. And by 2030, that would have increased to between 50 and 100 US dollars. So looking at it from its perspective of what needs to be done in the world, for every ton you want to compensate, actually, you would need to spend something around, say, well, between 40 and 80 dollars this year. And of course, being conservative and having and looking for your own impact, actually, you should pay $80. Which of course doesn't happen, but that's a different story. Many of us know carbon credits because of the many discussions that are going on the quality of the carbon credits. And this is a endless story, which basically is as old as carbon credits are going and will probably not end. And I have no solution to it either. Just naming a few of the issues. First, how real is the carbon credit compared to the emission that you want to offset? An emission that you want to offset is real because you can see here is a stack of my factory and I see smoke and there is CO2. I use so much oil or gas or whatever, I emit it, and you see it's a real emission. When you're going to clean that up, compensate that by a carbon credit, naturally the question is that the same ton of CO2? Or is there any tricking in between? And this is, of course, always, I mean, they try to make, we as a carbon credit consultants and the scientific community around it, we try to, well, make the realness of the carbon credit as large as possible. But in the end, it's not science. It is what you agree, what is real. Additionality is one thing. Additionality means, would this emission reduction in my carbon credit project happened also if I had not gone the carbon credit way? And of course, you can make a lot of calculations and a lot of arguments and make it appear very likely that carbon credits triggered the realization of the project, but you will never know. You will actually never know. And of course, there are projects where, in hindsight, it was quite obvious that they would have gone along irrespective of carbon income. And that's where discussion starts. Oh, now I have compensated an emission, my real emission, by a carbon credit, by which I actually doubt that that carbon credit would have, or that my buying it has triggered its existence. So that's one, additionality, endless discussion, and that's one of the things that, well, you need to, is one of the things that are the effects in discussion. Baseline setting is another one. Like, okay, let's take the example of clean cooking. I assume that the efficiency of an open fire is only 10%. And I say that all of the fuel that people use in an open fire has been unsustainably harvested. And therefore, the benefit of my improved cooking stove is everything from there. But who knows, maybe people using the open fire have only used waste wood and did not cut trees to get their fire burning. Or maybe the open fire had not a 10%, but a 15% efficiency, I don't know. So here you can see, you can tell that there is some leeway between, well, the number of credits you can claim from an intervention and the science behind underlying that. In forest projects, there is another big issue, which is called permanence. Suppose I compensate my emissions today with a tree that has been planted in Brazil. Fine, that's great. As long as this tree is still there, I can still claim that my emission has been rightfully compensated. But then in 10 years, that tree by which I have compensated my today's emissions, that tree gets burned because of a forest fire, or because of bad forest management, or because of a new owner of the forest that had completely different plans with the forest than the old owner. In that case, my compensation of today is being destroyed. And basically, I don't have any compensation anymore because the compensation is gone, is burned in fire, which is an issue. And which is called, well, which is when you're compensating your own emissions with forest credits, is an issue that one way or another you need to get, you need to manage. And there are a number of other things, like the reliability of my monitoring is a big thing. The leakage is a big thing. Like if I protect a forest here, then maybe other forest will be chopped elsewhere. So the net effect for, well, my role in protecting a piece of forest in one place is zero, because exactly the same amount will be chopped elsewhere. Standards, like I said, the gold standards, the VCS, the CDM, try to address all of these issues to the best extent possible, and they are succeeding in quite a good way. But in the end, this is about an agreement how people do it. This is not science. So it can always be criticized, and there will be cases where the criticism is completely real and has a very valid ground. Okay, so far the first introduction into getting to know carbon credits. Andrea or others, please shoot and ask what you want to know.
Oh, yes, well, so many questions. I mean, yeah, I think this like raises more questions than answers them. It's truly a whole ecosystem that actually I had no idea of. So thank you so much for this. Like idea, but again, just enough to be dangerous with. Okay, let's just go straight to the audience because there's already a lot of great questions popping up. Rick Walters asks, by definition, offsets won't get us to net zero, which is true, especially if it's still allowing things like cooking. So don't they have a limited usefulness over the next decade or so?
Probably they have a very limited usefulness, yes. The point is, and I mean, having built a career in climate projects and climate policy, I'm because of the discussion that's going on about the projects and how valid they are and how real the emission reductions are and what have you, you see that the projects in the end don't happen, which is a shame. So let there be no misunderstanding. I am completely convinced that clean cooking projects, that renewable energy projects, that tree planting and forest restoration projects, that they all need to happen for us to mitigate global heating. It just needs to happen. Actually, when you look at the amount of CO2 that we have already emitted into the air and the projections of how much we will still emit over the next couple of years, there is a necessity to suck 1,500 gigatons, so billions of tons out of the air within the next 10 to 15 years. And for that, we need these kind of projects. In the carbon credit world, we have been trained, and what I've just presented to you, what I've just presented to you is an example of it. We've been trained in trying to match 1 ton of my own emissions with 1 ton of carbon credits. And I would propose to you that perhaps that is not the correct thinking. Perhaps we should just think like, okay, guys, we need to reduce the atmospheric CO2 amount by 1,500 gigatons. Let's just do that. And let's not try to measure that with our own CO2 footprints, but just say, okay, this excess amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is our joint responsibility, and let's just jointly plant forests, do everything that is needed in order to get that CO2 out of the air, irrespective of how much I am flying or how hot you are heating your house. Let's just say, okay, this is our joint responsibility. We want to make this work, and then say, okay, how much will this cost? And each contributes to his or her or his company's abilities. That gets us rid of the discussion of, trying to nitty-gritty fine-tune my own emissions and the emission reductions caused by the carbon credit projects and the permanence of the carbon credit projects and how long does a cook stove last and blah, 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 all those discussion. We just basically say these things need to happen and we're going to finance that, all of us together.
Yeah. I have some also questions of my own that I would like to ask. One being, on what kind of markets are these traded? Are they private markets? Are there any public markets? And are any of these markets regulated?
Okay. Currently, the largest markets are, so there's two types of markets. First, there is regulated markets where companies or whatever entities have the obligation to reduce their emissions and are allowed to partly comply with those obligations by purchasing carbon credits. That's called so that's the formal market, and that used to be the largest part of carbon credit markets, particularly here in Europe, where big energy producers, big energy users could use the carbon credits out of the CDM to compensate for their own emissions. As from January next year, that is not possible anymore, and that's the end of this large part of the market. There are minor schemes as well, like for instance, in the US, a number of schemes, in Korea, in South Africa, I mean, all over the world, there are formal schemes where companies have emission reduction targets and are allowed to partly comply to their targets by purchasing carbon credits. The largest market so far at this moment, however, is the voluntary market, and that is the market where both individual and businesses decide for themselves, I'm part of the problem, I want to be part of the solution. And because I can't reduce my own CO2 emissions to zero right now, I compensate for the time being my emissions until I can get to zero myself. And that is the market where, for instance, individuals purchase carbon credits for their flights. That is the market where Shell is offering carbon credits for you to fill your car carbon neutral. That's the market where EasyJet says we have compensated the emissions from all of the kerosene we use in our planes. That's the market where a company like Unilever recently announced we are going to offset most of what we are doing as a company and also we are going to offset part of the emissions that are caused by our products through investing in forests, through investing in reforestation, etc., etc. That, at the current moment, is the largest part, and that has been triggered for a great deal by Shell last year, who went into the market to build up this scheme where you can compensate your, you can compensate the gas that you buy with them, and that is going fast at this moment.
Yeah, I see some questions here that I would like to address that I think are really interesting too. Maybe we can combine them. Do the carbon credits also apply for big emitters who could really make a significant shift in their total emissions? So I think let's talk cooking stove at grand scale. Can they also offer credits? And then another one is, because of the high cost in setting up that blue process in your flow chart, isn't the market biased towards industrial parties who have both the money to invest as well as the knowledge about the process? Smallholder farmers, tree growers from the developing world don't have these resources. If yes, how can carbon markets become a level playing field? So a lot to digest there.
Yeah. Okay. So definitely the cost of the blue process is huge. Definitely when you have a small project. So if you have a small project like a local small number of solar panels to provide electricity to one village or a cluster of villages, then the certification process is simply too expensive. Full stop. So yes, the carbon credit world is very much biased towards large projects, and hence projects with deep pockets, because you need to pre-finance a lot. On the other hand, let's realize we need huge amounts of carbon credits, or we need a huge number of emission reductions. So in order to make it efficient and to just take care that we get those tons of CO2 out of the air, we need to do that in big portions. Having said that, I think that for the smaller ones, for the smaller projects, carbon credits are simply not the mechanism to go. There should be other ways how they could get access to finance. I think that smaller projects should not bother with expensive consultants like myself, or I see someone from South Pole joining here in our call today. Smaller projects should not be bothered by going through processes where you spend a lot of money every year and again. They should have easier access to finance, to grants, to whatever kind of money to make their stuff work, and should not be trained to, basically get through a whole load of red tape that we have figured out here as well in the industrial world to make sure that our emissions are justly compensated. No. I would very much be in favor that also large corporates, in their efforts to become more climate friendly, would make available significant amounts of money, of funding to smaller projects, and not expect any carbon credits in return, but just make them happen.
Yeah, interesting. So yeah, I guess that is indeed a lot of red tape. Yeah, so much to unpack there.
Yeah, in many of the carbon standards, they have a mechanism where you can bundle a whole lot of small projects under one umbrella.
Yeah.
Called programs, where, what I said, where you can bundle hundreds of thousands of cook stoves or solar panels or solar lanterns or whatever under one umbrella and whatever. But that gives a huge power position to the organization setting up and managing that umbrella, who basically will then be in charge of who is getting what and how it runs. So there is a significant aspect of unfairness in those umbrellas, in those programs as well.
Yeah. Now we're running close on time, so I'm just going to ask you one last question, and maybe we could have an entire next webinar about this even deeper, because I'm so curious to explore this further. But I would love to know from your perspective, what, if you are a large corporate and you do set a carbon neutrality goal, what would be your way to approach that? What makes a good carbon neutral claim?
What makes a good carbon neutral claim? Well, first of all, any corporate should work terribly hard to first start reducing emissions within its own production process and within its own supply chain. That is one. That's where everything starts. So that's first. Then for stuff that is not happening yet, or stuff or emissions that are unavoidable, there you can think of, or you should think of, cleaning up those emissions through other measures. And in doing so, my recommendation would be, do that very generously to avoid any discussion on fairness, to discuss any discussion on additionality, baseline setting, leakage, permanence, whatever. Don't try to minimize your cost there. So if the average cost of an emission would be 70 euros or what have you, don't go for a €2 credit in order to offset your last and your impossible emissions. No, just spend a decent amount of money on reducing emissions elsewhere. And when you are a really big corporate, don't go and suck the money out of the market, but go there and side with project developers and provide them with upfront finance, provide them with tools how to get their projects going so that actually new stuff is happening, rather than that project developers need to wait until they have gone through this entire red and blue and green process and then maybe get bits and pieces in the very, very end.
Yeah.
It's all about fairness and taking responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, truly, truly fascinating. I think that our name is Net Impact, and this really embodies this concept down to the core. Can your negative impact ever really be compensated with positive impact elsewhere? So there's so much to continue with this, but we're over time already.
Are we? Oh shit. Yeah. Now, what I wanted to say, one last point. I think I'm very critical about carbon neutral claims, because I don't think anyone can call him, her, or itself carbon neutral until we have a global balance in the global heating. So definitely big corporates can't say they're carbon neutral when the world is still on fire. Definitely corporates that have still plenty of funding to spend, they need to take responsibility and go as much as they can to help stopping global heating. And then perhaps they can call themselves on our way to carbon neutral.
Yeah, excellent last words, really. Yeah, well, very inspiring, very curious, and so intriguing to take this further. Yeah, we have to stop here, so I'm mindful of all your time. So thank you so much for joining. This will be available on the YouTube, so there's a lot to come back to. So we can share the link to the recording. Yeah, well, wishing you all a really nice weekend, and thank you so much again, Adriaan, for sharing your perspective on these things. It's really, really fascinating. So
it was a pleasure being here. Thank you.
All right, everyone, take care. Bye.
Bye. Have a nice weekend.